A tiny island at the mouth of a river would soon become a gateway to the world. In the early 1600s, this patch of forest, tidal flats, and marshland lay quiet under the wind-swept skies of the Atlantic. It was a place of rivers and trails, of the Lenape people trading along waterways, of forests so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. Into this wilderness came the first Europeans, explorers whose footsteps would set the stage for centuries of ambition, conflict, and transformation. This is New York before it was New York. In 1609, Henry Hudson, sailing for the Dutch East India Company, steered a small ship up a broad, winding river. His crew stepped onto the shores of what would later bear his name. They saw forests, meadows, and streams bustling with life, and perhaps glimpsed the small, intricate networks of trade already in place among the native peoples. The landing was quiet, modest, and unassuming, but it marked the first European foothold in the area that would become a thriving hub of commerce, culture, and power. By 1624, the Dutch had established a formal colony, sending settlers to the southern tip of Manhattan. In 1626, they secured Manhattan from the Lenape in a transaction that would later be mythologized as a simple purchase for 60 guilders, traded goods like cloth, beads, and trinkets. In reality, it was far more complex. A mixture of misunderstanding, necessity, and cultural difference. The Dutch did not see themselves merely as buyers, they saw a strategic foothold, a place to build warehouses, docks, and forts. The Lenape may have viewed it as an agreement to share the land, not surrender it. Construction began immediately. Settlers heaved axes into thick forests, dragging timber through mud to raise homes, barns, and a modest fort at the southern tip of the island, Fort Amsterdam. Wood smoke rose from each cabin, the crack of splitting timber and the scraping of shovels echoed across the clearing. Life was hard. Every day demanded relentless labor, whether clearing fields, mending nets, or preparing salted meat for winter. One beam, one plank, one day at a time, the colony carved itself out of the wilderness. By 1644, the small settlement of New Amsterdam was beginning to take shape. Streets were lined with wooden homes and warehouses. Palisades guarded the edges of the town, and the West India Company oversaw trade that reached from the Caribbean to Europe. Life was orderly yet fragile, sustained by the rhythm of labor, the trade of goods, and uneasy diplomacy with the surrounding native nations. Treaties were forged, promises exchanged over council fires and makeshift tables. Trust was scarce, but survival depended on cooperation. A darker reality had begun to take root. In 1655, enslaved Africans arrived in New Amsterdam, their labor forced into the colony's docks, farms, and households. Sold as property by the Dutch West India Company, they endured harsh rules and constant surveillance. Their work was the backbone of the colony's growth, a quiet but brutal reality shaping the city's early economy. The streets and buildings that rose in the settlement depended on hands that had no freedom, on bodies pressed into relentless labor. Inside a New Amsterdam home, life unfolded in a single crowded room warmed by a brick hearth. Small leaded windows let in slivers of light that fell across rough wooden tables, wool blankets, and pewter dishes stacked neatly on shelves. Children helped grind grain or fetch water, while adults tended to chores, chopping firewood, repairing tools, and preparing food for the family. The air was a mix of wood smoke, drying herbs, and damp river winds slipping through the cracks. Evenings were quiet but full. Candles guttered low as stories were told, prayers whispered, and plans made for the next day's toil. By 1664, the colony's fragile balance was about to shift. English warships drifted into the harbour, their guns aimed at Fort Amsterdam. Outnumbered and divided, the Dutch settlers offered little resistance. There was no battle, only negotiation, surrender, and a new name, New York. The colony's identity, laws, and future were redirected without a single shot fired. Diplomacy sealed a new reality. The English now held the city, though remnants of the Dutch past remained visible in its streets, homes, and harbour. Even after the English takeover, New York remained a city of flux. In 1673, Dutch forces briefly reclaimed it, renaming it New Orange and raising old banners across the fort's ramparts. But the victory was short-lived. The next treaty returned the colony to England, and New York's English identity was cemented. The old Dutch City Hall, built by the West India Company, still served as a center of civic life, a reminder of the city's origins. Merchants, magistrates, and clerks moved through its cramped rooms, recording commerce, settling disputes, and keeping the heartbeat of a growing port alive. Under English rule, New York expanded rapidly. By the 1680s, the population topped 4,000. Brick houses began replacing wooden ones while port activity surged. The Great Dock stretched into the East River, a wooden artery where sailors, merchants, and laborers unloaded sugar, furs, tobacco, and other goods. The dock was a constant hum of commerce, creaking planks, shouted orders, and the thrum of trade connecting the city to the Atlantic world. Yet the city remained a patchwork of cultures and identities. Dutch architectural styles, steep gables, thick wooden beams, and narrow streets still dominated, while newer English touches appeared. Sash windows, broader chimneys, and orderly street grids. The old defensive wall ran along the northern edge of the settlement, marking what would later become Wall Street. At the Watergate, carts, travelers, and river goods passed under watchful eyes. A reminder that even as the city grew, vigilance remained a necessity. Tension simmered under the surface. In 1689, news from England sparked unrest in the colony. Merchants, artisans, and laborers drilled on the commons, caught between loyalty to distant monarchs and a desire for local autonomy. The citizen militia, a mixed force of Dutch, English, and colonial-born men, mustered in response to the glorious revolution. Officers signed declarations backing William and Mary, refusing royal appointees. The rebellion was brief, but it underscored a city living on the edge of uncertainty, where allegiances were fragile and the future was never guaranteed. Daily life continued amid these larger shifts. Streets like Pearl Street were crowded with traders, craftsmen, and sailors, all moving to the rhythm of commerce. The scent of tar from ship decks mixed with spices and river winds. Markets hummed with activity, taverns echoed with debate, and homes reflected both Dutch and English styles. Life in New York was a balancing act, between old customs and new authority, between freedom and servitude, between survival and ambition. By the end of the 17th century, New York was no longer a modest trading post. Its docks, streets, and homes hinted at the metropolis it would become. Trade connected it to the Caribbean, Europe, and other colonies. Its population was diverse, its economy growing, and its identity constantly negotiated between Dutch legacies, English rule, and the enduring presence of native and African peoples. The foundations laid in these early decades, Fort Amsterdam, the Great Dock, Wall Street, and the first homes would echo through the centuries. New York in the 1600s was a city shaped by ambition and labor, by diplomacy and conflict, by hope and hardship. Every brick laid, every barrel unloaded, every treaty signed was part of a story that would transform a small island at the mouth of a river into the center of a growing empire. It was a place of beginnings, of transitions, of possibilities stretching far beyond its muddy streets and timber palisades. From Henry Hudson's first landing to the surrender to English warships, from the building of the fort to the bustling docks of the late 1680s, New York emerged as a crossroads of people, trade, and power. The city's story was never static. It was a constant negotiation between the old and the new, the native and the settler, the free and the enslaved. And though its identity would continue to shift in the centuries ahead, these first decades of New Amsterdam and early New York laid the foundation for a city that would one day stand at the center of the world. This was the birth of New York, a city of change, resilience, and unrelenting ambition. And it all began on a muddy island, where rivers met the sea, and a small settlement dared to dream of greatness.